Hi, everyone. Thank you for tuning in to today's webinar on how to approach your FedLine assessments for financial institutions. My name is Nancy Patton, and I work within the Marketing and Communications Department here at Saltmarsh, and I'll be your moderator today. We're really glad to have you here, and we're going to be bringing you more industry-specific webinars in the months ahead, covering everything from compliance issues like fraud, fair lending, to developments in tech and cybersecurity. As you know, Saltmarsh has a team that focuses entirely on serving community banks, and we look forward to bringing you their expertise through these webinars and to share the latest information with you. Leading today's presentation, we have our resident banking technology experts, Stefan Reyes and Jason Keith. Stefan is a shareholder with our banking practice, and Jason is a senior technology risk consultant, both of whom have over 20 years of technology and cyber risk focused experience. Before we begin, just a few housekeeping notes to mention. First, everyone is muted. If you have any questions, you're welcome to share them in the questions feature, which is in your GoToWebinars control panel. If we have time at the end of the webinar, which I think we will, we'll answer your questions, and if we don't, we'll get right back to you following the webinar. Our webinar is being recorded, and you'll receive it tomorrow by email along with a copy of the slide deck. And finally, upon leaving the webinar, you'll be prompted to complete a very short survey. We ask that you just take a moment to share your feedback, let us know what you thought about the presentation and any other topics you'd like to cover in the future. And now I'm going to turn it over to Jason and Stefan.
Thanks, Nancy. Well, good morning, and thanks for joining us. As as you can see, we're going to talk a little bit about FedLine assessment today, and I want to be open and honest with you as we begin. I think this is a process that is kind of evolving. I mean, the Fed, when you read their FAQs and when you watch their webinar, and then when we kind of dig into the materials and look and see, and when I speak to those of you out there I've talked to about this, it's still something we're trying to get our hands around what this will look like ultimately as time goes by. This is the first year. So this year in January, they kind of said, hey, you got to do this. Actually, October of last year, they amended the guidance and said, you're going to start, signing the specific assessment, a test here, you're going to perform an assessment. And this is kind of a new process for us. So we're all kind of learning as we go. And I wish I could say I've got like great answers. I've got the 10 things you must do. And if you do those 10 things, you'll be in great shape. But you'll see kind of as we talk through today that a lot of this is us trying to figure out what makes the most sense. And so we'd love to have conversations with you as we go back and forth, kind of working through this together. I think the Fed themselves are figuring out what it's going to look like, how they're going to follow this process in the future. And so are we, all of us. So hopefully, if you have questions, please take this as a caveat to say, please jump them in. Give us all the questions you've got either now or later on, and we'd be happy to have follow-up conversations with you, because it's an interesting topic, and it's one that as we kind of develop this, I think, Stefan, this presentation here over the last few days, it seems like the more we read, the more we dig, the more we go, well, wait a minute, what about that? What about that? Typically the way the regulations, and this isn't reg, but the way that, you deal with these kinds of things and you start reading the material that's in there, you go, oh, well, this is pretty vague, or this is pretty wide open. So I think you'll see as we go, this is an unfolding process, and hopefully you gain something from this. And please feel like if you've got more questions, you say, hey, after I've thought about this, how can I follow up and do something else on it? Let me know. We'll be happy to have that conversation with you. With that, we'll kind of get on the right screen here. We'll move on here, just kind of talking about, I guess to get everybody on the same page. What has happened is, as you've dealt with the Fed through the years, you've known they've got all these requirements, and you're reviewing some of those requirements. You're signing off on those things as you add FedLine products and services, and they're telling you things you must do. You're getting tokens, you're destroying tokens, you're taking care of different items and different things. And what they've really done is kind of formalize, again, in October of last year, and come back and say, annually, we want you at the institution to sign off and say, you are looking at all of the things we've told you you must do to protect our systems and our product, and are actually doing it. And you're going to attest, which is the document that they sent you. If you haven't got it, we'll talk through that in a little bit. And you're also going to assess. Prior to that attestation, you're going to assess, am I doing all the things I'm supposed to do? So, just so you understand, new process, everybody's still kind of working their way through it. It's not due until the end of the year. You can turn it in today if you want to. You can turn it in 12/31/2021 if you'd like to.
And just to jump in there, as Jason mentioned, it is a new process, but as you touched on there, is from the purview of the Fed, they're saying, hey, this is stuff you've already supposed to have been doing in the past. The only new thing they're seeing it as is the attestation. So that's kind of an interesting angle they're taking to it, is that, as you see, as we go throughout this process, you'll see there's a lot to it. And Jason mentioned earlier, the more we talked about it, the more we said, wow, this really branches out. From the Fed's perspective, they're coming at this as, this is something you've always should have been doing. We've just asked you now to attest that you're doing it. So they don't see the changes being as big as I think that we're going to feel the impact on it from our side, I think.
And that's a great point, Stefan. I mean, you and I kind of talked about, we did a little bit in a cybersecurity standard that it's new and it's evolving, and it's for the defense industrial base. It's a government requirement that's kind of been pushed out for contractors of Defense Department. And they've kind of taken the same approach. And it's actually interesting. This may be a little bit behind it, but it's interesting to follow the thought logic here. And we're curious if we'll see it go through this iteration over time too. First, there were all these standards that you should do. There's cybersecurity things you should think about and do. And then they came out and they said, all right, we want you to sign and tell us, attest that you're doing these things. And you were supposed to do your own assessment, kind of the same way this is set up. And now they've come back and said, it really kind of starts rolling out next year, and for the next 5 years, you're going to have to pay someone to come in and do an actual assessment. And the way that they maybe kind of slowly waded in the water on it was I guess, maybe intelligent and smart. And it may be somewhat kind of the same process of, it's too late to say, this is a burden for me, because this stuff has already been in the things you've been signing and agreeing for several years. Now all they're saying is, oh, well, you're supposed to already have done it, so it shouldn't be a heavy lift to get there. So, it's not the same, but it's interesting that it's kind of following that, now we're doing an attestation. At some point, are we going to turn around and actually have to do some sort of audit that is truly an independent, you hire somebody to come in and do it? I'll be curious to follow that flow as well. Do you have something, Stephen? Sorry. So, in thinking about the program requirements, here are some things. Basically, you get this document. I'll show you that on the next screen, but here are the things that you're ultimately saying you're going to do. You're going to once a year go back and attest. This is, not the audit work, but the actual attestation, and say, I'm following all the requirements that you've given me. And then you're going to say, I promise I did a self-assessment. I did some sort of audit of myself to make sure that I'm following all those standards. Some cases, they may tell you it needs to be independent. We'll talk about that, what that looks like later on. And then something that was kind of interesting that we fleshed out a little bit in conversation, Stefan and myself back and forth, is, this responsibility for your service provider. I think it's pretty regular that I hear, well, I don't really use FedLine. I use my core. I use some other group to, to facilitate these types of transactions. It's interesting that they've kind of come back and re-highlighted quite a bit that even though you may not have to do all the heavy lifting, you still have got all the same requirements, and you've got to get proof from your service provider that they are doing the things that they're supposed to do, because ultimately you're the financial institution and ultimately it's your attestation. I don't know, Stephanie, you had some other thoughts there.
That is interesting how they've targeted on the service provider, but not well defined what service provider is and where they expect that line to cross. That's another place where we say, well, how far do you take this? Is it a service provider that's acting on Fed for you? That obviously makes sense. If you're using a correspondent bank or a core to do that process, that seems pretty clear. But what if you have a web banking provider that you allow wires to be generated through commercial customers, but that wire actually comes back to your core, and the core actually sees the Fed? Well, is that website now part of this process too? I think they probably would say it would be. The question about how many service providers get included in this is interesting. And even in the revisions that Jason kind of hinted about a minute ago, they specifically put a portion about service providers and the requirement to ensure that their policies have the necessary portions that are included in the Appendix A. So you're going to be reviewing your service provider's policies as part of your attestation. It's interesting how it flows down beyond just your own organization.
Right. So again, keep in mind, we're really just talking through that one-pager document that you're signing off on and saying, yes, we've done these things. So you're going to acknowledge that you understand you're responsible for your service provider. You're also going to then on the next one say, I understand I'm responsible for, I've done all this work, I've validated whether or not I'm doing these things. If I found some gaps, some control weaknesses, I'm responsible for putting in place some sort of program to make sure that I correct it in a reasonable time. And then, and this has become a bigger one, this duty to notify of expected or confirmed fraud there's a new update, and we'll talk about it a little bit more later as well, but a new update that takes effect in like 6 days, I guess the 30th. And it really is kind of digging a little bit deeper on when you notify, how you notify, what your responsibilities are. And that's, that's kind of this whole process. I mean, if you look back and you say October 2020, we had a change in Operating Circular 5. Now we got another one coming up here, and it's 6:30. It's ongoing. I mean, this thing can be amended and will be amended every year in some way, shape, or form, probably, and there'll be some additional things added. You're going to have to kind of keep on top of that as well. But this duty notify is really almost the entire focus of the updates this year. They kind of have streamlined it a little bit and said, here's how you notify us, and here's kind of what your duties are in that situation. And then, just what we said back earlier, I just want to kind of put in, and now these are Appendix A from the Operating Circular 5, which really is the governing document that establishes the need for this attestation and assessment process. Appendix A is the one that really adds a lot of that meat there, but a piece here just to note, you're not going to turn in all of your audit work, but you are supposed to do it. And you are supposed to, they're saying keep the appropriate documentation and hold on to it for the amount of time that you should. Just know that there should be some sort of backup to say, don't just look at 2 or 3 audits and get totally comfortable and say, of other areas and feel like you've got it and just sign off on it. You're going to want something to kind of pull back to. We think. I mean, we're still kind of guessing this process as well, but kind of think through it and make sure that whatever you have, if you're the one that's responsible for signing off, that you have some sort of documentation that shows what work was done, if it was ever pulled. I'm assuming in the event of some sort of loss, they may want to contact you and say, send me what you did. Let's see these gaps and see where you're at on them. So that kind of brings us to just the attestation itself. And we're doing this in a way backwards because you're going to do the audit first or the review first, and then you're going to attest. But we'll talk about the attestation because it kind of helps to know how it's coming at you. Because it seems like with some folks that we speak with, you still haven't actually gotten a copy of the document that you need to do the attestation in the first place. So let's start with where it comes from. It comes to the UAC, which we'll use that term quite a bit. But that's really just the person that's set up within your system to receive these types of notifications, to do the administrative functions of adding a user, taking a user away, those kinds of things. But it does not come from a Fed email, which is it's kind of an odd setup there. I guess it's so the document signing can work, but you may actually have had a filter that just filtered this out and you didn't even get the original email in the first place. But you would have got it from an @adobesign.com email. And you would have gotten a document that looks like this on the screen here on the right-hand side. This is actually the Fed's graphic. I didn't steal from any institution here on this. And it really is just, you see there's 7 little things that you're going to attest to there. It's got your name pre-filled on it. And then at the bottom, whoever it is that's supposed to be responsible for signing this, will sign it and say, yes, we've done all those things. And that's really all that you are at this point required to provide on to the Fed.
And there's a couple interesting things here. One is that they say they're delivering it to every UAC. So I think we have a potential of a UAC signing it, maybe not being aware that somebody else has signed it or not aware of the full process. So it's something we think you need to make sure that you're communicating with all your UACs that if they receive this document, that you centralize control of who's going to sign that and at what point. So that's one interesting thing. But also the email that's coming from is interesting to note. We all talk about the phishing and making sure that the valid response, where the email is coming from. The Fed's made it difficult in this place, and sending it from a vendor as themselves. So we don't really love the way they delivered it, but that's the way it's coming, and they've told us how it's going to be expected. So at least we know what to look for. But the other question becomes about what if you don't have any UX? What if you're only using third party? How do you get this? How do you get this document? And essentially their response to that is that you reach out to your provider who is acting for you and get them to provide you a copy of this. So that is another interesting aspect about the delivery method of doing this attestation.
Right. I mean, if I recall correctly, Stefan, the webinar you attended put on by the Feds, someone posed specifically that question: what if we don't have a UAP? What if you never actually delivered it to us in the first place? Well, you'd still, if I understand what you told me, it's still your responsibility. You still got to track this down and sign off on this. You still perform the attestation, even if you don't have a UAC in the system to have been sent. So that's, there's some kinks they're still working at, I believe, as well. But yeah. So anyway, as you can see here, who can sign it? They've got some very specific language on who can sign it. It should be a senior management official or an executive in charge of, and these are their exact words, electronic payment operations or payment security for your organization. And I think the natural first question I would have had is, does it have to be somebody from my official signer list? And the answer is no, it doesn't. You know, as long as who's signing it is one of those other things in the previous verbiage. So, you know, we'll kind of pepper in through here. When you see kind of this blue section here on the screen, that's usually a frequently asked question. So these are questions, and we'll give you that at the end. There's a resource page. If you haven't seen them, that's a great place to go look as well. So the Fed is kind of keeping track of FAQs that they want to answer and putting an answer in there. And it's easy, you know, anyone can navigate to it and read it. It kind of helps you get a little bit more feel for the process as well.
Yeah, and I do think that's another interesting note is that they're delivering this to UACs, but in many cases we're finding the person who's going to be the right person to sign it isn't a UAC. So having to push off that signature over from a UAC to another person in the bank is going to be a process that a lot of institutions are going to be going through.
Right. And then that brings up the other piece of this. In some cases, they may send you what you see here, which is an extra page that basically is how you know that you need to have an independent assessment. And now independent can mean many things. So I've kind of got here on the right-hand side, the bullet point. If you'll notice, there's really a couple of options here. So independent could mean some sort of third party to come in and do a review. It could be your internal audit or compliance area. But interestingly enough, and the reason I use the FAQ versus what is actually in the Appendix A of Operating Circular 5 is because they added this bolded language here. It's not bold, I bolded it just to kind of bring it out. But they also note, I don't know if this weakens it or makes it stronger, but they note that it, you know, even if it is an independent area of the institution, it cannot report up through that whoever's signing, basically whoever's in charge of payment services, whoever's signing that thing. So you can do it internally. Just because the word is independence doesn't mean you have to do it externally. And then the third option that they give, and again, this is their verbiage exactly, is you can do, you know, you can have it performed in-house and then have somebody review it if you can, I guess, get comfortable that, you know, they're independent, have them review it and sign off on it that they believe everything was tested that should be tested.
Yeah, our expectation is we're going to see a lot of institutions looking for third-party help completing this attestation, whether they have the independence requirement or not. But that was something the Fed was clear about, was that that independence does not necessarily mean third-party. So we'll see how that plays out. But the other key aspect is that the scope that they expect is the same either way. They don't expect there to be a difference in the attestation or a difference in the assessment. The only difference is whether it's independent. You know, there's an independence requirement. You know, the other question we saw asked at the event that the Fed put on, many people were asking, you know, what decides whether someone's independent or who has the independence requirement or does not have the independence requirement. And they were very unclear in their response to that. I think probably purposely so. They said it depends upon the type of service and the volume and, you know, the day of the week that your email went out. They didn't really have a clear answer of why one would have the requirement for independence and the other would not. Simply, they just explained how you would know if you were chosen to be, you know, one of the ones that would be in the independence group or not.
And you're right. There is also an FAQ on that. How you know, how do you choose who gets this and who doesn't? And the answer is we have a way to do it, but we're basically not disclosing it. So, so with that said, I think, you know, Stefan, now you kind of walk us through maybe some of our thoughts, because let's first start this off with the understanding that they do not give you a guideline to say how you should go about performing the assessment. They tell you, consider all the things, you must look at all the things we've told you to do, and you also must consider other things that are reasonable, but they're not going to give you a framework. So we're going to kind of spend a little bit of time talking through just some of the different things out there that you should consider and some of the sources that you need to look as you're trying to go through figuring out, how do I build this assessment?
Yeah, that's a great point. I think that initially when this came out, many people, including myself, thought this was going to be a process that relies upon an existing assessment, you know, something that you're already doing, you know, truly that was the spirit of it, and that there would not be a new assessment. I think it's a bit of a hybrid that we're going to have, just simply because of the areas that they're asking to be covered. I think you're going to have these areas covered in other assessments you're doing within the institution, but you're going to have to do a specific assessment for this process to kind of tie it all together, document it appropriately, so that you can feel comfortable that when you make the attestation, if you're requested for that documentation, you know, it's set for that year. There's areas that this is covered, as you see listed here, the focus areas that are listed in the documentation that's provided to you. You know, previously when we were looking at securing the Fed, it was as simple as, you know, is the router restricted so that only machines that have access to Fed software also have access to the router. No other access machines have access to that router. And it was a pretty simple test. Most people were doing it with access control lists. Some people did it with, excluded or separate VLANs. There's various ways they did it, but it was really just about excluding access to that router. Now they're expanding that view much further. Just like we talked about service providers, they've stretched that definition a bit further. They've done that as well. They're saying that they want to see a review of PC controls, hardware controls, and they're not talking about just the, I guess there's some lack of clarity in there about where the scope is, but there's no definition that the scope is only machines that use Fed software. They're talking about machines in your network that have controls and policies and procedures, not the machines that are using Fed. So I think this expands much greater than just the machines that most banks will have, and they have, one or two, or some larger will have a department that has them. But there's certainly secluded machines that would be using Fed. This is stretching beyond that area into the entire organization. And I think the theory there is that, if those machines have Fed, other machines have some interaction with them. And there's some soundness to that, but it's certainly expanding the scope of what we've seen in the past for a discussion about securing the Fed's controls.
Yeah, and I think what's maybe important to point out about the language here on the side is really just at several points through the documents you read where you've got to start thinking about this as you've got the things they tell you should do, and then they say you've got a duty to also just protect in general the institution such that we can be reliant that our systems are safe and our network traffic is safe, and things that we've asked you to do are enough. So you still have to protect your physical, your virtual environment outside of it enough so that I guess they can get comfortable that that their system is safe.
So we talk about assessment methodology and ways to put this together, and the first bullet point here really is the source of where this is all coming from the inclusions of Appendix A. The enumeration of some of the controls they put in there, again, it just speaks to the breadth of what this is covering. The particular areas in security and control procedures, as you're coming through your process, reliance upon existing security checks, reliance upon existing assessments that are in place aren't going to be adequate to supplement this methodology. The question about whether the independent review comes is interesting to me, because if you have, they even bring up a question of would a SOC report serve as an assessment, and they specifically say no. I find that interesting, particularly when you're relying upon your service providers organizations and how you get comfortable with, are they doing these things? Because that's traditionally how we've done that. When we look at our service providers and say, hey, how do we get comfortable with their controls, their password policy statements, their certifications, how do we get comfortable with that process? We're typically dependent upon their third-party assessments. I think that's still going to be part of what we do here, although I did find it interesting in the frequently asked questions that Jason keeps referring to, they specifically brought up saying that that's not enough, which they didn't go on further to say what is enough, but they did say that that's not enough. But there is a specific control area for that process.
And Stefan, I think I think it's a good point to bring up. So when you're looking at they send you a program guide. When they send you this as attestation, they send you a 5-page program guide that comes with it, and it kind of refers back to. So look at Operating Circular 5, and it says check out your security control procedures, which are documents they send you when you first sign up for all these things. And then it says, hey, look at your password practice statement. A lot of institutions will have people sign those annually, but it's got some things that users that access the system should do and how passwords should work. And you kind of recertify, here's what I do, or here's what I'm supposed to do. You've got this certification practice statement, which is almost like end user controls, where they've got things that they're saying our system will do and manage, but you also have your responsibilities as a participant in it and as a user of it, and here's the things that you'll rep to doing. And so all of those have different little pieces that you should go into, dig out, and try to figure out, how do I look to make sure we're doing these things or acknowledging these things. And then occasionally they'll send some other guidance. And one thing kind of flowing through this, I know we use the term UAC a lot, but that's the person that's usually typically receiving this information or notification that's available, especially if it's new information. So make sure that you kind of get with that individual, pull them into the fold if you're going to be trying to figure out how to keep this audit process going on a regular basis.
We often find that UACs aren't tied closely. I was going to say, we often find that the UACs aren't tied closely into compliance in some institutions, and that's a challenge, because the communications coming to the UAC and they may actually connect it back to your compliance group who's thinking about these practice statements, thinking about these things and making sure they're happening. So that's going to be a change in what the institutions are doing. They're going to have a more close relationship between compliance and UAC, and perhaps even have a UAC in compliance.
Right. I mean, it's not abnormal to say that's the person that kind of helps keep the wheels moving. They add people into the payments, employees as they need to, and move folks out. And so the EUAC hasn't typically been, in a lot of institutions, the person that is sitting in audit, also thinking from that perspective. They're the one that actually is administering the system and setting up users and giving rights and taking rights. And I'm sure they're used to a regular audit of the area, regular review of, are these rights appropriate? But they're not necessarily someone that has flown through the process of having an annual audit set up, and here's the guidance and here's the new information. So it's something to kind of keep in mind, that this is going to be an ongoing process where I think you're going to need an EUAC that is really in tune to all these changes.
Now the liability section, and Jason and I were talking about this just yesterday and more today. Some interesting things to note about there. There's a bit of an excerpt there on the top of that slide that is pulled from the appendix, specifically discussing how the Fed is very certain that you are taking on all the liability here, right? They say that anything that happens here, they even go as far as to say that the institution will provide reimbursement for the legal fees of the Fed if they have to defend themselves, which is interesting how far they go. But the great extent here is to say, you guys as an institution are responsible for anything that happens, and they go down here to list some specifics about what those things are. But it is a clear indication of them, trying to make it clear to all the institutions that they expect to hold you liable for any breach or process.
And I think it also highlights again, and even though this is really kind of getting into the liability section, it's also listing things that maybe they'd expect you have, but I don't feel like they've necessarily called out in the other areas of their guidance, like a customer education process. So there's quite a few things here as you'll read through it, and you'll go, okay, well, I know that there's a backup process. They want me to have a backup process, but now that actually gets pulled in perhaps. And patching. They're interested in my patching process. How do I evaluate that during this process? There are things that are regular kind of IT area audit work and regular physical security audit work that now you want to at least consider how it's influenced with this new perspective, this new review that you're doing.
And of course, changes are coming. That's the key. As Jason mentioned a minute ago, and we talked about, not only do we see all these frequently asked questions, but we see updates that came out just, I guess it was it a couple weeks ago that they released this update that's coming out effective June 30th. That we need to watch those. Those I think will come out more this year, even not until next year. I think we'll see more this year because this is the first year of the attestation, and I think they're working through some of these questions, and we're hoping that they'll better define some things like service provider requirements and some other issues there. But the biggest change in the notifications, or sorry, the biggest change in the circular that came out in this new version that's effective on June 30th happens around notification, as Jason mentioned. Not only does it get more specific about how to notify, which that's of course very helpful. Before it said you had to notify by both in writing and by phone. That was the extent of the description. Now they say here's the phone number, here's the email address, and here's the timing. They also give you specifics about that you should notify if you know or suspect. There's a level of when you have to notify them that is kind of concerning, and I don't think we put too much into that in this point of our presentation about that standard about when you know or suspect. But that, in my opinion, working in this field, that is a scary standard, because what means that you should suspect that there was fraud? I think that's going to drive people to making some more notifications than they normally would, because they want to err on the side of, oh, I've made the notification. But we'll be interested to see if that happens and what happens in response. What is the Fed going to do with these notifications? Are they going to actually respond to each one individually? Will there be a further questionnaire? I'm very interested to see what happens on these notifications. But that fact of know or suspect should be fraud, that suspect process concerns me about how often that has to happen. The other thing that came in that change is specifics about including that requirement for notification in your policies and procedures. So they want to make sure that you integrate into your policies and procedures, into your incident response procedures, that there's this notification requirement and how that notification is supposed to happen. And then to take that a step further, they want you to attest that your service providers have included this part of this notification requirement into their policies and procedures. So this change really is all about that notification process. And I honestly think that notification process is going to be probably the most interesting thing about this attestation, to see how they respond to these notifications and how institutions choose what to notify and when. But obviously there'll be more changes coming. This one is pretty restricted to that area, but we're still watching for them.
And I think you mentioned it, but I think it's important if you read the parentheses here, they're saying disaster recovery plan, cyber security, I assume incident response plan is kind of what, think about all the different policies that are impacted, and they're saying you need to put in first language that says we should be contacted, and then I think I'm reading also this is how you do it, the phone number you call and the email address that you send. So they're wanting you to integrate this in not just to your Fed perspective, but just to your overall policies as well, as far as how you'll notify.
Yeah, so that'll be a big impact on your incident response. And again, there's some question about what is considered a notification requirement incident for Fed. Did it actually have to involve Fed? Was it a machine that could have had Fed, but yet the specific incident didn't involve Fed? Where that line is going to happen is another interesting question that I don't think they've well defined. So we'll be interested to see how institutions choose when and what to notify on. And of course, the frequently asked questions. There's several noteworthy ones, as we're mentioning here. At the end of the slides, and you guys will all receive these slides, there is the link, if you guys don't have it already, to the page that they've set up, specifically for these changes. There is at the bottom of frequently asked questions stuff, and it's very, very informative. In fact, that's probably some of the most informative portion of their site is their response to these questions. Some of them, like we mentioned, about the question of who gets selected to be independent, who doesn't. Some of those questions aren't as forthcoming as others, but some of them are very informative, and I think will help us understand how to implement the process in general. The question about, do all banks need to complete an attestation the size of Reyes? The question is clear. Yes, all of them do, even if they don't have Fed services in the bank. That was an interesting response from that specific question. Getting that attestation form from your provider, I still think is kind of a questionable process how that would happen. But that is the requirement at this point, is that you must fill it out for, even if your provider provides all your Fed services. And I think this is just that same FAQ that I was just talking about a minute ago, saying, do institutions that connect to FedLine through a service provider need to attest? The answer is yes. Yes, you still need to attest, meaning that you've got to contact that service provider. Number one, ensure that they've done their attestation, that they've updated their policy, that they're following their service providers, but then also gain access to an attestation form for your own institution, and then provide that to the Fed as well.
So, and I think in here, maybe at the bottom, it kind of says, okay, we're not going to tell you exactly how to do it, but you are going to need to get information to support that attestation, and then you may decide, is that enough or do I need to add more? And I think there are points where you could probably argue, no matter how your environment is set up, you should at least have some additional steps that you consider as well. So, you're going to now need, and it, like we were saying, it may not be just the SOC report. You're going to need to be able to figure out how to get with, and I bet our service providers are all working through this process as well, how to get with them, get some information that proves that they've thought through it and that documents your review of their review, so that you can comfortably come back and do an attestation yourself.
Yeah, even if we just talk about the updates to the policies and procedures for notification as required by this change, that wouldn't be available in a SOC report. A SOC report's not going to tell you if their policies have that. So we're going to have to increase what we do for due diligence and for vendor management on those kind of vendors beyond what we have in the past, just because there's requirements of this that aren't part of the requirements before. So do we have to do a separate vendor due diligence for this? No. But can we rely on our old one? No, we really can't. So the answer is we're going to have to probably do a bit of both. The independent assessment, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, this one really is a restatement of what we had said,
exactly.
earlier. Okay. It doesn't have to, there's a specific definition in the guidance of what independent is. Go back to that specifically, and just note that this bolded section is specific to the FAQ, not to the Appendix A guidance that I guess truly governs this process.
Yeah, it was interesting in their presentation when we had that live question and answer with them, their response to this as well. And it seemed like they were pretty open to having this internally as long as it was completely independent. But what they considered completely independent was they had no process in any type of wire transfers, but they went beyond that. Even the normal audit process, they didn't, when they asked, well, so would our internal audit function be independent? And they said, not necessarily. Well, but that was the extent of their response, not necessarily. So they haven't clearly given us an indication of what they're going to consider independent.
And speaking of not clear,
sorry.
I was going to say, speaking of not clear, here's another good one for you, Steph.
Yeah, I guess this also goes back to the point you made earlier, Jason, is that there's no requirement for you to provide any of the assessment process to anyone. They're telling you to do the assessment, document the assessment, maintain the documentation of the assessment as per your documentation policy that you already maintain, but all you send back is the attestation that you've done it. So when you go out and do this, and you do this in an independent way, and you sign off on the attestation, whether they're going to accept that was appropriately independent or not appropriately independent, I guess they'll find out if there's a breach and they research it. I mean, when else are they going to come upon that question? I really don't know that answer, and I think they leave that out there. And again, as far as clearing, they don't have a clear guidance on how to conduct this. This is really something they're going back to that statement of, this is really something you should have been doing the whole time. We're just asking you to attest that you do it. So that seems to be their fallback on these kind of questions.
So I guess let's talk a little bit about where you go to find more information. And I hate to tell you, there's just, it's all Fed specific. That's what we're dealing with. We're dealing with the Fed. So you're going to need to spend time on the phone, probably with your customer contact center, getting a little bit more information if you still have questions after kind of going through all the particular guidance out there. But there's a couple places you should look. There is a Assurance Program Center, which is what this whole, I guess, initiative is called. It has some FAQs on it. It has some other interesting information. It kind of goes through a little bit of a detail. It even has, when you go in there, it has the PowerPoints for the webinars that they did earlier in the year. Now they did a couple at the end of 2020. They did a few at the beginning of 2021. And if I read what it says there, I believe it says we don't see a need to do any more of these. We think we've done enough. So you probably won't be able to sign up for additional webinars on this through the Fed specifically, but you can at least look through the PowerPoints and see. And it's really, it's really at that point just kind of again, almost in a way like this has been. There's a program, you need to consider how you're going to work it in, and you need to need to assess and attest. I guess I keep saying that. And then also go look at the operating circulars. Now those are all open for anybody. You don't have to have the login or do anything like all of this stuff here. Really, it's open. You call a customer contact center, they're going to want you to validate who you are, for they're going to have a conversation with you. But all of this stuff you can kind of go read up on. You don't have to get with the UAC and actually log in and to look at most of this information. Now there are some specific directives and some specific documents that you will need to log into the system to pull down, as far as the actual control requirements for which particular product you're using within the FedLine suite of things. But so just take time and kind of go sit down for an afternoon and read through what the Fed has to say. And really that's, the FAQs is a good place to start, I think. Especially if you've watched this, if you sit down and read through those FAQs, you'll get a bit of an understanding that, again, I think what I said at the top of this is they're still figuring out exactly how it's going to look, and we're all still figuring out exactly how it's going to look.
Yeah, in various formats, we keep seeing people asking the questions about some standard to do this assessment through, and the response, the continuous response back from the Feds has been that to refer to the guides, refer to OC5, refer to the security documents that are provided to the UACs, but none of that is a standard to make an assessment. Those are all just statements about where security should be. But there is good information on there that does give you an indication of what they're hoping that you will review and protect. But getting back to that security guide and the information that's provided from each individual product you use from the Fed is important to make sure you're including that in your assessment methodology.
And then, so I guess maybe kind of to sum it up, some closing thoughts for you, and then we've got a couple other slides, and then we'll take any questions that you have if you have any. We weren't sure when we started this if we'd have questions. This is kind of one of those wide open things. Maybe you sent a few in, maybe you haven't. But happy to take them now. If you want to go ahead and start typing them in, we'll look at them as we go. But so in closing thoughts, I guess maybe make lemonade out of lemons and say this is flexible, so I can make it the way that I want to make it. I would suggest this: if you're going to add another review to your annual process, see are there ways that you can leverage what you have to do for this to maybe reduce some of the things that you're doing for other areas, and try to build it in a way that works best for you. You can do it at any time. Something we haven't mentioned here is you can sign that attestation at any time during the year. It doesn't have to be 12/31. If you wanted to today, you could go out and do all the work and then sign it tomorrow. And it's a point in time. They make a point of saying this is a point in time. You're saying at this date, here's where my program was. I'm attesting that it's in good shape. So you can kind of now start working on, well, where do I want this to follow my annual audit schedule? Where do I want this to follow my regular review process? Is it better to do it in the summer months? Is it better to do it in the fall? When works best for us? Because this is going to be an ongoing kind of annual thing. So be thinking about that you can kind of build the process for what works best for you next year and the year after that and the year after that. Go ahead.
But one thing I want to impress on people is not to rush to do the assessment, or not to rush to do the attestation until you're comfortable with the assessment. Now, that doesn't mean you can't have some gaps in the assessment and a gap analysis that has a list of items that you're hoping to improve on that you need to include, but have that assessment completed and documented before you do the attestation. I would not want to see an institution in a position where there were some incident, the attestation's already been provided, and the assessment wasn't quite ready, or the assessment wasn't quite done to the level you'd like to do. So rushing through the assessment, I don't think is a great idea this year. There is no requirement to have it before the end of the year, but as Jason mentioned, there's no requirement to wait till the end of the year either. So be thoughtful about when you do that attestation, but I certainly wouldn't rush to do the attestation for its purpose.
Right, and I mean, I guess being a thinking through that a little bit more, I mean, I guess from a legalistic kind of standpoint, you would say, hey, every minute that I wait is probably better, because I would hate to have attested and then have some event that occurs and they say, well, you tested it and said everything was in good shape. Where was it that you missed? So there's something to be said for, especially this first go around, maybe you wait to the end, but I do want you to know you can do it anytime. It's acceptable to do it anytime. You just have to have done it by 12/31. And even if you don't have it done, I'm still not entirely clear as to what that means. There is a question about that. What if I don't have it done by 12/31? And, they sort of allude to the fact maybe you could lose services and maybe you wouldn't. Just call us. It'll be on a case-by-case basis if we, grant some additional time to complete it. So again, they're still working out that first year. Everybody's working out that first year. Something else to kind of focus on this is, just make sure that this is going to have a heavy technology focus. Definitely. There's lots of technical controls. There's lots of software. There's lots of access controls. There's lots of things there. There's also some physical and some policy driven and some just general good old-fashioned security type things that need to be reviewed and considered as well. It kind of runs the gambit of a lot of things. It's going to be infused throughout your policies and your process. Stephen, I think you were going to say something. I'm sorry if I interrupted you.
No, I was just going to say, and part of that strategy, you mentioned that this is a point in time, including this check on technology. So although we're saying, there's no time requirement when this needs to come in, working that into your normal schedule, as Jason mentioned, makes perfect sense. But the two key things I want to make sure that people aren't not doing is rushing to get the attestation done before the assessment's prepped, but also not leaving too much space between when you complete the assessment and you complete the attestation, because that assessment is a point in time, and you want to make sure those two match so that there's not something that changes in between those two times. So if you're going to wait till later in the time to do that attestation, you may need to do another gap assessment prior to doing attestation, even though you've done the majority of the work earlier in the year. So make sure that assessment and that attestation time period is pretty close together.
And, I guess I'd also say document the work that you performed. I think there's going to be some of us that have, and I would have been heavily tempted myself to say, I've got an IT audit, I've got a this audit, I've got a that audit, I've got a wires audit, and I think I can look at those four and be comfortable everything's covered and just go ahead and sign off on it. But you probably still ought to sit down with some sort of rationale and write through why you think everything's covered. Make sure that you document it, because I do believe that if they're asking you to document it and they're asking you to hold it in a retention process and treat it like a regular audit, they could potentially ask you to provide that later on. So
no question, it'll come up at some point, yeah.
So just think through, making sure that you get it set up and documented and run through exceptions and gap analysis and fixing things just the way you would with any other review that's done at the institution as well. And then I know we mentioned the circulars, they are regularly updated. There's other things that come out. There's announcements that get pushed. Make sure that you've got a process in place to capture it. If this is going to become part of your audit universe all of a sudden as a new thing that has to be looked at specifically each year. Make sure you got a process in place to capture when those things are changed. And as we started looking through this, we're like, well, darn it, they've actually gone ahead and updated this thing again. It's going to be, in 10 days, it's going to be updated again. It's one of those things you almost got to be in it regularly, kind of looking and checking for and seeing what's going on, what's changing. So you want to make sure that you develop, and we've said it a few times, but a process with your EUAC to be on top of this, to make sure that as things are communicated as having changed, that it finds its way to the audit department or whoever's going to be in the end responsible for doing this process. And then I know I said it earlier, but I think you're missing an opportunity if you don't start thinking about this as it's just something that, what are the odds it's going away? It doesn't cost the Fed anything to do. So what are the odds they're going to say, stop doing this? I think it's just going to be something that you deal with every year. It's going to be something that you test every year. As they update and make changes, there'll be some new things to add. So get it on the calendar. Don't let it sneak up on you and catch you. It's just something that we're going to be doing, I guess, from now on, if we want to do business with the Fed. And with that, I'd say, I've got 2 other quick slides that I'm going to go through, and then we'll take any questions if there are any, and we'll let you go. We'll give you back probably about 10 minutes of your time. So the first thing is we do try to make, and we're trying to make even more of an effort to do more of these, these webinars, these outreaches, just some communication about things going on within the banking space. We try to capture all that and get it here on our website. So here's a little bit of information on places you can go and get some of that. We also send out regular updates. Make sure you sign up for that. And we're trying to be, again, even more intentional about all of these different service areas that we offer, making sure that we're giving more information to you. And then the second piece is we have, and I think we went virtual last year. COVID was the reason. This year we weren't sure we're virtual again, but we have a pretty good process in place for our bank talk. You've got a 3-day series there of things. The first day, I believe, Nancy, you correct me if I'm wrong, but it's really kind of focused on sort of that executive process for institutions and panels and things that you can read through. The second day, we have an IT focus. We've got several presenters lined up this year. One, I think that'll be pretty interesting on cybersecurity, or not cybersecurity, cyber insurance. It's something new that we're kind of adding, but I think a lot of you are experiencing more issues with getting cyber insurance renewals, and the fees are going up and all sorts of things. So we're going to kind of put somebody from the industry on the hot seat, let them talk a little bit about it. And then the third day, we focus on compliance. So there's funnels there. You can be in the days that you want to be in, and you can be in the pieces that you want to be in. But I recommend you look at it. It's something you can attend virtually. It's part of the day. It's not your full day, and pop in and out as you need to. But that's coming up. Get registered. There's a link here as well. All right, Stephanie, any questions?
Well, let's not forget, before we go to the questions, I just want to add on that. Let's not forget, we love to talk to people individually. You have our email address. You'll have it at the end of these slides and our phone numbers. Please reach out. We'd love to have a conversation with you about what you guys are seeing in your institutions and questions you're having. We'd love to share with you what we've gleaned from other institutions. Any way we can help, we'd like to have those conversations one-on-one as well. So please feel free to do that. And our contact information will be out there. I do have one question that someone had posed there, and that was a question about if there was an attestation template form that they can circulate to determine who's receiving this. And I think what they're talking about is a sample form, so they can say, hey, have you seen this? The place that on the web page there, the resources that we put out, there is a screenshot of a form that was provided. In fact, we used it for one of these slides. So there's also one in these slides here as well. There's a screenshot of a sample, both independent and non-independent requirement attestation request. So that requirement is there in the resources and is also included in our slides. Nancy, do we have any other questions? I thought I saw one, but then it disappeared on me.
It was about the attestation template. So like you said, there is a screenshot available. And we'll include that link to the screenshot for you guys in our follow-up materials, along with a copy of the slide deck and a recording of the webinar. But it doesn't look like we have any more questions. So any other closing thoughts from you guys?
I would say only that with sorry, Stephen, with the attestation question, I've seen several of the ones I sent to the different institutions out there in the country, and they look exactly like the screenshot. I mean, it is exactly what you see in the screenshot, except it has your name pre-filled on it, or the institution name and information pre-filled on it. But otherwise, it looks just like that. And if you have any specific questions about it, just shoot me an email. We'll help you find what it looks like. Sorry, go ahead, Stephen.
Yep, that's all I was saying. Reach out if we can help you.
All right, awesome. Thank you everyone for joining us. And at the end of the webinar, you'll be prompted to complete a very short survey. So we love to hear all your feedback. Have a great day.
Thank you.